Homeostasis. This is the ability to maintain an internal stable condition and is accomplished by different kinds of feedback mechanisms of the body. We have two feedback control systems that maintain homeostatic set points. We have a negative feedback system, we also have a positive feedback, and we also have a feed-forward system. The set points is an established range that is acceptable to the human body. For example, blood sugar levels. If you are fasted, the human blood system should be between 85 to 125 mg per dl. That means if you are below 85 or substantially above 85, that could indicate that you are going to be either pre-diabetic, or you might be diabetic, or you are hypoglycemic. It's important that there's a healthy range because fluctuations to the environment can occur, and our body is largely responding. And when you don't respond to the environment, then oftentimes you lose control of the homeostatic system, and that can result in illness or death. The internal conditions are obviously fluctuating, and there is a concept of dynamic equilibrium. Dynamic equilibrium means that it is not a fixed point, but rather a fluctuation that occurs. So it is changing, and it will go up and down. It varies based on temperature. It varies based on the amount of blood sugar levels, your pH levels, the amount of glucose in your body, the amount of lipids in your body. And you can see in this picture that we have three parts to the system. We have a sensor that is going to be a nerve or skin or some structure of the body that picks up a change. The controller, which will be your CNS, your brain and spinal cord. And then you have an effector, which is going to be either a gland inside the body, an endocrine or exocrine gland, or some kind of muscle, like the cardiac muscle, the smooth muscle, or the skeletal muscle. And your body responds by allowing one of these effectors to release a chemical or for the muscles to contract. Here is an example using temperature regulation and showing you how the homeostasis works. The body temperature regulation is ideally about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Anything above 104 marks a fever. So when your body temperature begins to increase because you're outside in the sun, your thermoreceptors in your skin begin to send signals towards the brain. Your brain contains a region called the hypothalamus, which will detect the temperature and serves as a thermostat to trigger vasodilation, otherwise known as a widening of the blood vessels. And that will cause the blood flow to begin to lose and dissipate some of the heat to the air. This will then also, in some cases, trigger and activate sweating mechanisms. So your sweat glands activate to perspire. So the response is a cooling effect via sweating, and you have this increased heat loss. So you lose some of that heat off, and ideally you should be able to maintain your temperature, bringing it back down, and therefore closing this loop. Another example could be blood pressure. If your blood pressure is too low, you have receptors called baroreceptors inside the arteries near the heart that will send signals to the brain, and that will then change the rate by which your heart contracts, thereby increasing the blood pressure. So if your blood pressure is too low, it could speed it up. If your blood pressure is too high, it could slow it down. Another example is using the glucose, sugar. And on the right-hand side, you can see when you eat a lot of food or you have a cheat day, you might elevate the blood glucose levels in your body. The pancreas has a set of cells called beta cells, which will pick up that signal, begin to release a chemical hormone called insulin, and insulin will then float around the body and trigger target cells in your muscle and your liver to increase this glucose transporter called GLUT to begin the absorbed sugar so that you reduce glucose levels. And if you can do that successfully, blood glucose levels is in check and you have a negative feedback to go back to where you want to be. However, a positive feedback is going to be a little bit different. Positive feedback utilizes a one-way direction, which actually, instead of resetting, it actually is a self-amplifying effect. So self-amplifying means that it favors one direction, so it favors the same direction of change. One example is in female labor. So when a female is going through labor and delivering a baby, the process of the human body begins to be more violent. A hormone known as oxytocin is going to be released, and that will trigger the target receptors in the female uterus to contract and contract until the baby is delivered. There is no other hormone that counterbalances this hormone. That is an example of positive feedback. Another example could be blood clotting. Imagine you have a wound and you got to get that coagulation pathway started, and you don't want the blood to leak out of your body anymore and lose more blood volume. So your body triggers the clotting cascade to begin to favoring of proteins to block off the blood loss. The fluid compartment of the body is highly regulated, and inside our cells we have the ICF, which is going to be the intracellular fluid, and we also have the ECF, which stands for extracellular fluid. What is inside the cell versus what is outside the cell will be very different. There oftentimes is going to be a gradient, which is a difference in variables in chemical composition, electrical charge, physical pressure, temperature between 2 points of the body. So the inside of our cell versus the outside of our cell. It will be very different. And because of this difference, it allows you to have this gradient to allow solutes and ions to move from an area of higher point value to an area of lower point value. On the other side, when you go from a lower point value to a higher point value, that requires energy and input. So blood circulation is a key example of how your body moves down a pressure gradient. Each time your heart beats, the blood flows down its gradient away from the heart, and it goes all the way to your leg and eventually makes its way back up into your heart. ICF generally is going to be a little bit less positive charged. So the outside of the cell is slightly more positively charged than it is on the inside of the cell. And fluid imbalances can oftentimes result in cells to be dehydrated, even potentially cell death. And a fluid that allows water to move between the membrane is called osmosis. We'll talk a little bit more about diffusion later on, but it is one special form of diffusion in which the water passes through a membrane. Feedback mechanisms maintain the fluid compartment volumes, and you can see that majority of the water in the body is found inside the cell, inside the cytosol, 60%, whereas 40% is found in the extracellular fluid, and that comprises of the plasma, interstitial fluid, and there are two mechanisms that drive water motion and fluid motion in the body. We have one, hydrostatic pressure, versus the colloid osmotic pressure. The hydrostatic pressure is going to be the pushing effect of fluid against the blood vessels, and think of it as you're trying to open a door into a room. So colloid osmotic pressure would be the exact opposite force, the pushing of the door out, restraining that person from entering into that room. So these two pressures have to have a balance, and oftentimes on the arterial side of the blood vessel, you tend to have a higher hydrostatic pressure, hence the arrow is green and it faces upwards. And on the venule side, you tend to have a higher colloid osmotic pressure. If this was not the case, then oftentimes a fluid could be trapped inside the interstitial fluid, and as a result, some patients might develop edema. Edema is a situation where fluid reabsorption and filtration are not balanced, and it gets accumulated inside the interstitial fluid, related to liver issues because of the protein albumin not being properly generated and not being properly managed.